and I kind of want to do business with you.
We're going to do business.
Okay, so I would like to just open up the floor. Maybe we could talk briefly about your work on Museum 2.0 and then whatever else you want to get into.
Well, look, there is a sad truth to the art business. Selling art is very, very difficult. And generally, people are not that interested in culture or cultural production. So when you walk into the world and you talk to people about philosophy, I went for sushi the other day. I sat next to a professor. I was like, what do you do? He said, I'm a professor. I said, of what? He said, of philosophy. I said, where do you teach? He said, UC Riverside. I said, fantastic. I love philosophy. I said, you like Jean Baudrillard? And he was like, who's Jean Baudrillard? I was like, excuse me? You're a professor of philosophy at UC Riverside. I said, do you like Guy Debord? He's like, who's Guy Debord? I said, he wrote a book called Society of the Spectacle. So we live, I believe, broadly speaking, in a society that has, like, it has been eviscerated culturally. And when you sort of leave the little worlds that we live in and go out there, it's a disaster. And culture is really the cornerstone to civilization. It's the cornerstone to social political economies that are sustainable. So we, in a sense, from my point of view, are in a kind of a war. Not a war against a particular kind of culture, but a war to sustain culture itself, in the same way that I think you would, you try to sustain the earth by not killing it. And the art world has built a myth that art is exclusive, that art can elevate you. It can elevate generally the bourgeois who become connoisseurs. So the bourgeois become connoisseurs because they acquire good taste. And then they are elevated. But connoisseurship, I think, is a really dangerous word, because what you do need is knowledge and taste. You need knowledge and taste. Knowledge and taste does not equal connoisseurship in the art business. The art business essentially has figured out a way to distinguish connoisseurship as having access to an elite set of artists from a unique set of distributors, and having the good faith and good ability to recognize it and purchase from them. So which has isolated many artists from sort of the central system. These myths are sort of built in the post-war period. The myth of the artist as a genius. The artist is a moral person. The artist is being disinterested in money. The artist, they really are myths. I mean, Mark Grochan, who's one of the great artists, drives around in a Bentley and makes a fortune of money. Picasso drove around in a Rolls Royce. But some of the art world feels comfortable in these myths, because the art world is sort of occupied by, on the left, intellectuals, who are generally left-leaning and quasi-Marxist, and on the right side, by sort of capital and money that is sort of monopoly capitalism at play, because it reflects essentially the state of capitalism that we're in. We aren't in a market capitalist environment, we're in a monopoly capitalist environment, sort of an evolution of capitalism. But Marxism and capitalism are really the same system in an invert. They really are the same construct. So the art world is sort of ballasted between these two components, where you have like the Whitney biennial, which is very controversial this year because of the Dana Schutz's Emmett Till situation, which is Dana Schutz's practice filled with this kind of narrative painting? No. So it's out of nowhere. She should absolutely be able to paint whatever she likes as an artist. But for the curators of the Whitney, the way that they constructed that show, they didn't construct it like an art exhibit, exploring the ideas of art as decoration, as art as beautiful. They explored it as identity. So essentially, they put identity above art and kept the art below identity. So the whole show becomes about identity politics. And therefore, the Dana Schutz situation is sort of like the Whitney gets what it deserves. You're not discussing art, you're discussing identity. And I think it's tricky. And what we need to do is we need to sort of elevate art to its position, because what generally, I buy a lot of work by Joseph Albers, and I was interviewed recently by a publication, and they interviewed David Zwirner's, one of the directors at Zwirner, David Lieber. And I said Albers is a great decorative artist, as well as being a great conceptual artist, because you have colors and you have squares, and you know, Obama put it in the White House, and it worked really well. And the messaging that came out as well as sort of David Lieber was, he's not a decorative artist. Because of course, if you're an artist who decorates, therefore you're below the level. But most people use art in their homes to decorate. You go to a Chinese restaurant, they've got stuff on the walls to decorate the Chinese restaurant. You go into the toilet at the steakhouse, they've got shit on the walls to decorate. So what the art business has done, they've sort of alienated these forces: decorative, ethnic, and feminine. Decorative is associated with feminine, in my opinion, and decorative is also associated with ethnic. So you have this sort of marginalization of, this mass marginalization of decorative, ethnic, and feminine, which is called, oh, it's too decorative, it's not deep enough. But really, in a sense, the roots of it are sort of part of the sort of patriarchal structure of the business, the sort of almost colonial structure of the business that alienates. And in the post-war period, in which the art world has been built up in New York primarily because there was a network that developed of curators, museums, collectors, you know, that showed and sold and traded to each other and marketed. The sort of art world expands, and we sort of come to like the 2000s where there's 7 billion people and not 3.5 billion. We've had economic growth. Things really begin to accelerate like this. And the art world really gets entrenched in this kind of behavior. The mythologies are become excessive. The institutional curators sort of dig into this sort of liberal-minded sort of thinking. The market guys dig into sort of the centralized distribution of sort of a handful of artists. And we have what arrives, the internet. We have the pre-internet, which is where you would go to websites and explore shit and discover things. And then we've got the post-internet, where the internet has now been consolidated into a handful of very specific modes of communication: Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. You know, a select group of people that's literally consolidated the internet, shoved us all in there, in which we all participate and share. And that has really been quite effective for the distribution of cultural imagery and the representation of cultural production through sort of a multitude of networks. So we can even look at a small event today that has a group of probably 25, 30 people in the audience, filming, taking pictures, Matty putting it on. And we suddenly take this little event and it explodes out into the network, like a virus that you can control. Now, generally the people who have always understood this have been street artists, because street artists were always excluded from the system because they didn't make the kind of cultural production that the gallery system found acceptable. Or they just didn't have access to the gallery system and didn't have a platform to exhibit their work or produce their work, so they sort of moved to the street. And I think Keith Haring is a great example of that. You know, begins in the 80s with this sort of radical sort of, you know, street interventions, you know, probably out of frustration initially, but it sort of gathered steam and was able to audience build outside of the traditional gallery system. And guys like Keith Haring, I'm sure, are collected by people who are street art collectors. I'm sure he's liked. So the street art business, I think, was almost like the first wave of this movement. Like, it was the first wave of what's happening outside of the internet culture. But it basically built the infrastructure for the self-marketing and self-distribution of cultural production, and also for collectors to engage directly with artists, you know, and dealers, of course, outside of the traditional elite system, whereby if you were a plumber walking into Steve Lazaridis' gallery, he would have treated you just the same as if you were on the board of the Museum of Modern Art. There was sort of an egalitarian spirit about it, and I think that was very, very important. And I think something that the art world never even bothers to examine or discuss as being part of sort of how we got to this place. So I think what happens is there was then a transition whereby a lot of the street art collectors essentially got sophisticated. They learned that the internet began to give them a little bit of access. They could go to a gallery, take a picture, and see. They almost graduated. They kind of went from high school to college, and they began to engage in emerging contemporary art. The price points were similar to street art: $10,000, $5,000. They could afford it, and they could sort of begin to engage, and they engaged in a very, very different way. And this created, I think, to a large degree, the sort of boom in emerging contemporary art, which was highly speculative, fast-moving. And I think the reason why it was so speculative isn't so much the collectors. It's the response of the artists who came from this sort of Marxist left-leaning education system, and the response of their gallerists who have this mythology of the collector as occupying a very specific role. The collector is a connoisseur who's going to keep your art forever, because it's like literally a myth that's taught at art school that, I got to tell you, I sell a lot of art. I don't, you know, I have a handful of collectors, and you know, I probably sold work to 250 different people over the last 2 years, 3 years, which is an enormous range. And I would say out of that, if 2% are real collectors, it's a lot. It is a myth. And so the art world and the sort of the artists respond to it in this way that is not understanding that the actual fundamentals of the supply and demand for art has changed. They didn't adapt to it. Now, what I mean by that is interesting. And in every industry, we have a supply chain, from banking to clothing to coal to hospital care. And the supply chain means there is a producer of goods and services, there is a wholesaler of goods and services who manages the production, you know, and he sends it out to the retailer. So you can think of oil that gets refined, and the oil that gets pulled out of the ground, then it goes to a refiner, then the refiner sells it to the gas stations. In that process, production can be regulated, or we're not going to refine this oil, we're going to store it for a year or two. You have a communication along all the lines of the supply chain that helps regulate. So what's happening, the traditional system has misunderstood the expansion of the global art market and the huge interest in emerging contemporary art, but has not innovated a new system to take this into account and manage the artist's career. So what we have in emerging contemporary 2-3 years ago is we have a sort of a collapse of emerging contemporary pricing. I still think emerging contemporary pricing is still relatively high. Like if you bring up Lucian Smith and you sell a painting for 40 grand, I think that's unbelievable. So, you know, from an art world perceptive point of view, they want to attack anything that is not monoculture. That, you know, you've got big galleries who rely on a handful of artists to do most of the revenue. They generate huge amounts of top-line volume, and they keep the big galleries alive. And many of them are the dead white male artist estates where they do the most of the business. So it's really not particularly good if collectors start saying, oh, gee, I can buy a this for 300,000 and it's good as a this for $4 million. So, you know, there's a huge interest to kind of like, you know, you'll meet many collectors, traditional collectors, who like come up to you and they say, oh, I collect blue chip. I'm like, you wouldn't know the difference between a blue chip and a brown chip, you know, if it landed on your head, basically. You know, but they're sort of groomed, you know, some noodles, soggy noodles at Mr. Chow, and you know, sitting next to someone well-known or in distance to someone well-known, and you think you're a connoisseur, you just spent $600,000 on a piece of garbage, and you could actually buy something good. So they're real interests that are pulling apart. The left doesn't want you to penetrate the system because they want intellectual control. They want to have that USDA prime meat stamp of approval. So I believe that from a business perspective, we need to build a sophisticated, proper supply chain so that the artist produces cultural production. There is a wholesaler financier who manages that production and communicates with the retailers. Now, if any of you have dealt with galleries, they are inconsistent, oftentimes unprofessional, many times late to payment or non-payment. And if you've dealt with the big galleries as a younger artist, you're just not going to get the attention, you know, if you're selling something for $20,000 that you would if you were selling something for $3 million. So there is a sort of, we're in a no man's land for emerging contemporary. For young artists, we really are like, you're fucked if you do. I shouldn't swear. It's terrible.
You can say that.
Okay, thank you. You're sort of messed up if you do and messed up if you don't. So for me, what's interesting in analyzing sort of the market is how do I build a system underneath the triangle? And the top of the triangle is this sort of concentrated monoculture of high-level distribution. How can I create a platform under here to support a group of emerging contemporary artists and market and distribute them. Full of challenges, full of a lot of things. And the internet really, for me, I can time it with sort of the explosion of my business. I was started in 2007 prior to the internet, when I was collecting guys like Joe Bradley and Cory Archangel and Tauber Auerbach when they were $20,000, $10,000. So I was able to sort of pick the right artists because I think the eye is good. But the internet has really changed the field dramatically by fundamentally making one change. I have this mantra, I always say it, I say the periphery is the new center in a networked environment. As it's really an interesting kind of thing. The center was New York, 1950, 60, 70, 80. It was London, 1960, 70, 80. Those were the centers of the world. You wanted a picture of an artwork, you'd have to send a guy over with a view camera, and he would photograph the artwork with a view camera. He would then make a transparency, he would then pop it in the mail and write your name on it and then send it to you. I mean, that is a production and an episode. So you don't have great documentation. Distribution is extremely slow. It's like walking through a swamp. The internet, digital media, high-res cameras just came out, 50 megapixel Hasselblad. I don't work for Hasselblad. But this camera can basically practically take virtually, professional pictures of any piece of artwork here at a click of a button. So it's really the whole system of technology for documentation of cultural production has changed the game. So the quality of cultural production, you see the quality of a picture I take here of this painting by Matty Mo is almost equivalent to the quality of a picture that Anton Kern takes of a Mark Grochan picture. So you have this sort of approximation of the quality begins to come together of reproduction. And so you sort of have this barbarian horde coming into the gates, and you've got and you got everyone trying to keep it up. What I want to do is really take the gates down and figure out a way to integrate these two systems, integrate the outside and integrate the inside, because the inside has a lot of great infrastructure. It's got deep knowledge, it's got experience, it's got collector relationships, it's got institutional relationships. It's in a distribution system that is extremely effective through the art fairs. So I think one of the misnomers about what I do is that I want to attack and destroy the system. I think what I want to do is I want to re-engineer how the wires are connected. I don't want to take down the infrastructure. I'd like to turn that infrastructure and slowly bend it so it meets with sort of a different infrastructure. Now, Matty Mo is an artist who goes outwards. He projects outwards. The art world projects inwards. So, a friend of mine inquired to I use a lot of proxies to buy from me, because at this point I find it so cumbersome and tiresome to have the conversation with the gallery about what the art is. It's just easier to sort of say, what's your name? What's your name? Yes. So Jonathan, I'll give you a name of a gallery. My name's Jonathan, I like this artist. If they don't know you, say I'm a great collector, I live in wherever, they'll be sending you work. They have these myths of who's who and who's who. So I learn a lot from the responses that the system asks. What do you collect? Nothing. I just saw a piece of art when I was having a cup of coffee. I walked past the store, I really dig it. I make a lot of money, I'd like to buy it. What do you fucking collect? What did you eat for breakfast? Are you fucking kidding me? When you go to Artsy and you register on artsy.com, I was thinking about this. Every time you're like, I'm interested in this piece of art, you get a pop-up window. Have you bought from auction before? Yes or no? How about none of your fucking business? Next thing, what do you collect? How about none of your fucking business? What artists are in your collection? Have you bought from a gallery before? I'm like, what is this? Am I at the doctor's office? Like, am I getting a blood checkup? And I think like this is so institutionally in the system that like even on Artsy they have this like, so immediately if you're not a collector, if you're a guy who's got a deli or a successful butcher and you're making good money or you're whatever, and you want to collect, and you suddenly like see on Artsy an image, and you say, have you bought at auction before? No. What you collect? Orthodontic equipment, you know. It immediately puts you in this mode of being defended. You're defensive. You're like, okay, well, am I good enough for this? I'm not a collector. I don't have anything in my collection. It immediately suddenly puts you on the defensive. And this has been rejected by, in my opinion, so many people, and so many people with a lot of money, because there are guys out there who have made hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, millions of dollars, who like the minute you out, they're like, I just want to buy something. So the art world has sort of filled itself with a closed system, like the royal family, whereby they're all professional collectors, which basically means they basically, in different time periods, trade art like a stock. So when you go to the art fairs, at the VIP openings, whoever has time to be at every VIP opening of every art fair, I would say a large portion of these collectors are what I call professional collectors. In other words, they're dealer collectors. They buy something, they hope it goes up. When it goes, they sell something, buy more. It's totally fine. But the art business, the art world has kind of professionalized a class of collectors. And this class of collectors is kind of like, it's a little messed up now, because like they're all selling to each other. It's like musical chairs. And they have ignored this sort of total outward expansion, or I wouldn't say ignored, they've kind of been reticent to do things. So like Matty Mo, we come to Matty Mo. So I'm here, I'm going to be perfectly frank. He's an interesting artist. I'm not going to collect his art, you know, ever.
You have happening.
I have one. I did. I gave it to Natalie, who works with me. She loved it.
I wouldn't collect my art either.
I don't blame you. But there are guys in Silicon Valley who like his art. They understand it. It's non-confrontational. And I'm sitting in this seat because what we need to do is we need to build a bridge. And we need to take situations like Matty Mo that are outward reaching, expansive. Because what he is doing, despite the art he's producing, whether I like it or not is irrelevant, he's building an armature and a bridge to new people. So he's like literally like building a suspension bridge across mountains that you can walk across. Once those suspension bridges are built, you can then start carrying goods and services across them, and you can turn them from suspension bridges into permanent bridges. That bridge is so critical to build, because what happens is as you build the bridge, people learn more. I've watched people collect at the beginning. I watch them 5 years later, 10 years later, and we have to sort of take this like centralized fine art world. We need to open it up, number one, so we can get more of the good shit that's being produced out there. We also need to open up the fine art world so they can let some of the good shit that they're not represented for whatever reason get in there, by sort of breaking down these like silos of decorative, ethnic, feminine, outsider art, not, and we got to kind of mix it into one component, because we are in a cultural war. And we're not in a cultural war that defines we like Donald Trump or like Hillary Clinton. That's not the cultural war. We're in a cultural war for for culture, just to get culture back into society. So you look at the bankers, the hedge fund guys who essentially buy art purely for its sort of investment grade kind of thing. They have funds, they think of return on capital. They've really sort of marginalized art to sort of its puerile form as a monetary instrument, which denies it the opportunity to decorate, carry ideas forth. It's highly problematic, and the gallery system has sort of understood this, so they raise prices every 2 years, regardless of what the real market says. Give people the idea that their investments are sort of on the rise. So you'll have a guy like Michael Riedel at David Zwirner, who starts at 35 and then goes to 70 and then 120 and just keeps rising, and then at auction they sell for $10,000. No one talks about that. They talk about Lucian Smith and Oscar Murillo. They don't talk about Michael Riedel. They don't talk about Anselm Riley. They don't talk about so many of the artists with the mainline galleries who who are in this situation, they talk about the successes and they sort of exacerbate the failures. We'll talk about this. Cultural war. So the war is a war to save culture in its form, no matter what that culture represents, whether it's Matty Mo's culture, and going to the technocracy, which is the sort of the technocracy would be, a lot of the world is sort of controlled by the technocracy. The technocracy has no relationship whatsoever to cultural production. They like music, they like pop stars, they like celebrities, they like films. But from an artistic point of view, and an art point of view, and a philosophy point of view, they've built these systems that are sort of libertarian, egalitarian, they have their own sort of philosophy, but there is a total disinterest and lack of understanding of culture. So the Medicis in the 16th century, who essentially made a lot of money, the Medicis were like the Mark Zuckerbergs and Larry Ellisons of their day. They were doing their shipping and all of this, the exact same kind of businesses. They understood intrinsically that their investment in culture would change thinking, would change the cities, would be a bolster against the Catholic Church. It was basically helping to secularize, the power that the church had over the state. They're deep-rooted sort of philosophical intentions and aims with it, and very important. Like, I think if Michelangelo and many other artists didn't secularize the church through their cultural production, we'd be still in the Dark Ages. So I think like it was a breakthrough when he painted the Sistine Chapel and you saw the butcher there and the fishmonger and all these people. So I think I have a responsibility to build a business and stay in business, which is very difficult. The art world is a very challenging place to make money, very challenging. No matter how successful the myth is that you are, every day is a struggle. You've got to go out and sell another piece of art, keep the doors open. It's tough. But our responsibility and the core mission I have is how do we expand cultural production outside of the art world and bring in new participants at scale? And you do that, one, directly, where you can get new clients. You also do it indirectly by planting the seeds of this kind of engagement and letting other people do the work, because you need an army to do it. You can't just be Stefan Simchowitz doing it over. You hopefully get copied. You hopefully the sort of system begins to sort of take over the art system, and you essentially, in a couple of years, hopefully have a new system. And I think that's like one of the core missions. And I think it's central, not to sound grandiose, to democracy, to a value system that needs to be salvaged and saved and protected. And I think that the art world has really been rather alienating in this mission, in that they have made it about exclusivity. It's not inclusive. They've attacked. They've basically. They basically sort of suggested that plurality is more important than popularity. I think it's a very complex thing that I think we have to sort of look for plurality and popularity at the same time. We can't do one at the expense of the other. I think that's one of the sort of the fundamental flaws of the liberal system, is we do need to be pluralistic, absolutely, but we also need to reach out to a broad popular audience, because the only way to migrate that audience is not to alienate them. The minute they're alienated, they become extreme. And so that's the general mission.